for me. Oh, the Lord, He keeps on doing great things for me. Oh, He keeps on doing great things for me. He keeps right on doing great things for me. Hey, if I had 10,000 hands, come on and wave the hand. Oh, would use every one of them just to praise the Lord. Yeah, yeah, yeah. 10,000 times. Wow! I will use every one of them just to praise His name. You know what? 'Cause He knows me so much better than anyone else that I know. And the Lord, He takes better care of me than I can do for myself. I won't get out and He's right on doing great things for me, for me. He keeps on doing great things for me. Oh, God has smiled on me. He has set me free. Oh, God has smiled on me. He's been good to me. Come on and sing it. Oh, God, yes, He has. Yeah. Oh, God, yes, He has. He's been so good. He woke me up this morning. He started me on my way. Put food on my table. Put shoes on my feet. Yeah, it is so good. Hey, He's been good to me. Oh, He knows me better. So much better than anybody else in here that I know. And the Lord, He takes better care of Sean than she took the house. I can't even tell you that He keeps right on, right on, right on, right on, right on. Right He's been right. He keeps on doing great things for me. He's been good. Never been good. He's been good. Well, good morning. Welcome back to another reading of Inside the Mind of BTK. We are up to chapter 5, and it begins like this. It was getting late when I looked up from the stack of pages detailing the Kathy Bright homicide. The sun had vanished, and a coating of darkness had descended on the world outside. I decided that maybe it was time to pack it in and head home for the night. I was tired. I gathered up my stacks of crime reports, wrapping rubber bands around each individual pile, tossed them into a bag, and trudged out into the darkness to my car. A few minutes into my half-hour drive home, I realized exactly what I needed to do. It was something I hadn't done in nearly a month. So I turned the car around and stared north toward Quantico National Cemetery to visit the grave that had been intended for me. Months earlier, when it was assumed that I'd probably never pull out of my coma, some bureaucrat in the Veterans Administration reserved a plot for me in this newly opened cemetery that had once served as a blockade point for Confederate troops during the Civil War. When I refused to die, my plot was given to someone else, but I knew its location and felt a kind of strange attachment to the place. There, but for the grace of God, I often thought to myself. The grass was damp with evening dew as I walked through the cemetery looking for the grave, clutching my flashlight as though it were a club. A full moon, bright as a medical examiner's lamp, had just crawled above the hickory and oak trees in the distance, helping illuminate my way. Before climbing out of the car, I had grabbed the sheaf of papers detailing BTK's next victim, Shirley Ryan, murdered in her bedroom as her children, who had been locked away in a bathroom, pleaded with the killer to leave their mother alone. I didn't know what the hell I intended to do with all those papers, but it seemed only natural to bring them along for my nighttime stroll through the cemetery. I started coming here months ago thinking it might provide answers to all the questions my brush with non existence had left me. For someone who had surrounded himself with death for most of his career, cemeteries felt like a natural extension of my office. Nevertheless, something about the darkness on this particular night set me on edge. I'd never been here at night, nor had I ever told a soul about my visits here. Why would I? No one would understand. The last time I'd come here, I happened upon the grave of a little girl whose brutal homicide I once investigated. Although it was a sober coincidence that she'd been buried near my would be plot, as I stood above her tiny body, I felt a flash of panic surge through me. For years, I'd been advising cops to keep their eyes on cemeteries because my research had shown that killers sometimes visit the grave of their victims to get close to their accomplishments. In the case of this little girl, police had a viable suspect, but they were never able to link the two-time convicted felon directly to her homicide, and this caused a tiny shiver to run up my spine. What if the cops have her grave staked out at this very moment? I had thought, peering over my shoulders to determine if I was being observed. They're probably looking at me right now, thinking they finally nabbed their killer. But on this night, I cut a beeline straight to my plot and plopped down in the damp grass. I stared at the white headstone that appeared to glow in the darkness. The man who ended up here had served in the U.S. Army in Vietnam, so had the men buried on either side of him. Closing my eyes, I sucked the cool evening air up into my nostrils, and before I knew it, caught myself praying, asking God to help me. Balance your life, John, I thought. You're falling back into your old ways. You're losing control again. If you're not careful, you're going to end up here. From somewhere behind me, I heard a twig snap. In a split second, my fingers wrapped around the butt of the revolver that hung in the shoulder holster I wore beneath my suit jacket. Then I wheeled around to confront what I imagined to be my assailant. But all I saw was a deer chewing on some dried leaves. I stood up, fumbled for the flashlight beside me, and hit the animal with a white blast of light. It bolted towards the woods. My heart was pounding as I sat back down in the grass, chuckling over my edginess. I looked over at the sheaf of papers I'd carried with me and decided that this was a good place as any to begin boning up on BTK's next victim. I spread the pages out in front of me and, with the help of the moonlight and my flashlight, began reading again. It was early afternoon of March 17th, 1977, when Wichita Police Lieutenant Bernie Drawatsky pulled up to the house at 1311 South Hydraulic Street, located 2 miles northwest of the Otero residence. The fact that Drawatsky kept showing up at BTK crime scenes was hardly surprising. Bernie was something of a go-to guy with the Wichita Police Department, the type of cop who loved to stick his nose into just about any call from dispatch he heard come over his car radio. All he knew from the radio was that the woman who lived there, 24-year-old Shirley Vian, had been strangled. As he walked up to the front door and stood on the rundown wooden porch, he couldn't help thinking how much the tired white wooden siding reminded him of Kathy Bright's house. Yet another murder he'd helped investigate. Jawotsky went inside, and a patrolman who arrived earlier gave him a quick tick-tock of the events as told to officers by Vian's 5-year-old son, Steve. According to the boy, a stranger had entered the house, locked him and his 8-year-old brother Bud and 4-year-old sister Stephanie in the bathroom, then proceeded to murder his mother in the adjacent bedroom. No more than 30 to 45 minutes had passed between the time the killer walked into the house and departed. Jawotsky poked around the small, hopelessly cluttered place. 2 doors, one from each bedroom, led into the bathroom. To prevent the kids from opening one of the doors, the killer looped a length of new nylon rope to a pipe beneath the sink, then tied it off around the doorknob. The first thing that struck Jawotsky were the knots. I've seen those before. Something about them reminded him of what he'd seen at the Otero murder. Just wasn't the kind of knot that someone in the Navy or the Scouts would tie. It was like someone had taken a basic clove hitch and kept tying it over and over again until he stumbled on this new one. Shirley's nude body was laid out in the living room near the open sofa bed. 2 white adhesive EKG leads were stuck to her chest, left behind by paramedics who initially thought they might be able to revive Vian. Newspapers and shoes littered the floor. A tattered, overstuffed chair sat in a corner beside an ashtray heaped with cigarette butts. Paramedics arrived at the scene a few minutes before 1 p.m., not long before police. A neighbor made the call after Vian's terrified son ran over to her house screaming that his mother was dead. They found her in the bedroom, tied to the metal bed frame. Nearby, vomit had formed a kidney-shaped puddle on the dirt carpet. Because her body was still warm, police estimated that 15 minutes had lapsed since the killer had left, and the room was so dark, the EMS technicians cut the white nylon cords looped around her arms and legs, then carried her out into the light, vainly hoping to be able to resuscitate her. Her face was a mess, splotchy red from cyanosis and hemorrhaging with a haze of blue. Dried blood and vomit was caked around her nose and mouth. The rope around her neck had left a hideous rust-colored abrasion on much of her throat. 2 years after her murder, when detectives from Wichita first showed up at FBI headquarters, wondering if my unit could provide any help on the case, I nearly gasped upon looking at the photos of Shirley's body. Even after the years I spent viewing crime scene photos, she had the kind of corpse you don't forget, the kind that occasionally came back to haunt me in my dreams. That's because one of the things I do as a profiler is take that expression frozen on the face of a murder victim and work backwards. I have to place myself inside the head of both the offender and the victim at the time of the crime. Her lips, along with much of her face, exuded a dull, cold, bluish tint. Her last thoughts, I felt sure, were about her children. She cooperated with the intruder because he'd no doubt promised her that he wouldn't harm her three kids. But the moment she felt that rope tighten around her neck, she knew she made a terrible mistake. Like Joseph Otero, she lay there racked with guilt, totally helpless, praying that the stranger who seemed so intent on killing her would leave her daughter and two sons alone, hoping that when it was all over, they wouldn't be the ones to find her. Reading between the lines of the crime reports, I sensed that Shirley was forever trying to straighten up her sad life, but never quite could. By the age of 24, she'd been married twice and had had three kids, all of whom lived with her. She raised them the best she could, and just like the Otero parents, she was adored by her kids. Her oldest boy, Bud, was thought to have a cognitive impairment. Her sister Stephanie suffered from various learning disabilities. Steve, at 5, appeared to be the only member of the family without some kind of learning or intellectual deficit. Shirley now lived with her husband, Rick Vian, who was away at his job at a construction site when the murder occurred. Her kids were frequently absent from school, and on that particular morning, they'd stay home because their mother had stomach flu and didn't feel up to getting them ready for class. Earlier that morning, she'd sent Steve to a nearby grocery to fetch some chicken noodle soup and 7 Up for her queasy stomach. At the time, it wasn't that odd for a 5-year-old to run an errand like that in Wichita. Vine phoned ahead and told the storekeeper to keep a lookout for her boy. She also asked Steve to pick up 2 money orders totaling $40. As Steve returned home, a stranger stopped him on the sidewalk, not far from his house, pulled out his billfold, and showed him a photograph. He asked the boy if he'd seen either of the people in the picture. Steve told him no. The man, who was carrying some sort of a bag, continued to question him about the identity of the two people in the photograph, but Steve insisted he had no idea who they were. Eventually, the stranger allowed the boy to pass, but as Steve walked off, he turned to watch the man continue up the street, then stop at the home of his neighbors and knock on their door. The boy had been home about 10 minutes and was mesmerized by a cartoon show on TV when someone knocked on his door. He opened it and saw that the same man who he talked to out on the sidewalk was now standing on his front step. "Excuse me, son," the man said. "I've lost my dog. Have you seen any lost dogs around here?" "No, sir," Steve replied as the man peered into the house. "Is your mother home?" he asked. "Let's ask her. Maybe she can help me find my lost dog." Steve stood there with Bud by his side as the man pushed past them and walked over and turned off the TV, which Stephanie was glued to. Next, he pulled the shades down over the two front windows. The front room instantly went dark. The kids were confused, not quite sure what to make of this strange man who barged into their home as though he lived there. And when he noticed the children staring at him, he pulled a pistol out of the shoulder holster hidden beneath his jacket and pointed it at them. "Where's your mother?" he demanded. "She's in there," the siblings shouted in unison. But by then Shirley had heard all the commotion going on in the front room. She had been lying in bed in her room, but managed to drag herself out into the front room when she heard the stranger's voice. "The hell are you doing?" she demanded. "Who the hell are you?" The man walked over toward her, brandishing his pistol. "Shut up," he snapped. pointing toward the bedroom, and get in there. The telephone rang before she could move. Steve stared at it, but the intruder said, "Leave it alone." Next, he glanced around the house and ordered Shirley to gather up a blanket and some toys, then instructed her to spread everything out on the bathroom floor. After hustling the kids inside, he pulled some rope out of his pocket and went to work looping it around a doorknob, then tying it to the drain pipe beneath the sink. He exited through the other door and soon could be heard sliding a bed against it, effectively sealing the kids inside. A defiant Steve threatened to untie the rope, but the man quickly made him reconsider. "You better not, or I'll blow your fucking head off," he shouted. Shirley pleaded with her headstrong son to do as the man said. From inside the bathroom, the children heard the sound of adhesive tape being torn from a roll. Steve pushed open the door with the bed shoved up against it and peeked out. The image he saw was of his mother, lying face down on the bed naked. Her hands had been taped behind her back, a rope tied around her neck, and a plastic bag pulled over her head. The children had no idea how long they were stuck in that bathroom, but reported that it felt like an eternity. And then the telephone began ringing again, and Bud somehow managed to climb up on the sink and break out a tiny bathroom window with his fists. Blood quickly began streaming out of the cuts in his hand as he screamed for help through the window. Stephanie joined him. By this point, Steve used all his strength to kick through the bottom panel of the door that the killer had tied to the sink. The boy was so angry at the man who he'd seen hurting his mother that he ran into the bedroom with his fists balled up, ready to fight. But the man had vanished. Steve glanced at his mother, still lying on her stomach on the bed. She didn't move. He sprinted outside and was standing on his neighbor's porch a few seconds later, pounding on their door. "My mom is dead," he screamed. "Call the cops." The neighbor rushed over to Steve's house and found Bud and Stephanie sitting beside their mother's body, sobbing. Let me tell you something about Steve. There's video. He's been on interviews and everything. And of course, he's a grown man. But he has been battling drug addiction his whole life, ever since he was a young teenager. He's been in and out of jail. And he still weeps decades later when he thinks about that day and what happened to his mom. And because of this, he was never able to get his life right. I haven't seen anything about him in like the past 3 years. But I just hope, he finds peace, but his life is ruined. This thing has haunted him his whole entire life, and you can't blame him for using drugs, just trying to erase the memory. I mean, it doesn't work, but it's really sad. That little boy is still around, that hurt, traumatized little boy. And this man is, good Lord, in his 50s now. And every time I see him, I get really choked up. I really feel bad for Steve. Paramedics were moving Vian into the front room of the house as police arrived, forcing detectives to rely on the children's memories to piece together a clearer, more detailed picture of the crime scene. Although much of it had been removed by emergency medical personnel, White nylon cord appeared to have been used to bind Vian's wrists and ankles, along with electrical tape that ascended up her legs in a pattern reminiscent of Roman army sandals. Investigators were never able to trace where the rope came from. Mm. An autopsy revealed that she had not been sexually assaulted, nor did her hands bear the traces of any defense wounds that she might have received trying to defend herself. So, how was the killer able to subdue Shirley? Police reasoned that he convinced her to allow him to tie her up, promising her that if she did, he wouldn't hurt her children. After making her remove all of her clothes, the killer placed her nightgown over her head, then slipped a bag over that. If the unsub did ejaculate while at the house, police speculated he might have done so in a pair of Shirley's panties, then taken them with him when he fled. In between telling the detective who interviewed them about the songs their mothers would sing to them when they couldn't sleep, the children did their best to describe the killer. They insisted he was a dark haired man in his late 30s or 40s with a heavy build and a paunch. Police, however, placed little faith in the information Vian's kids provided, especially the description of the suspect. Because the $40 in money orders that Steve picked up at the grocery had been taken from the house, investigators believed the robbery may have been the initial motive for the crime. Nevertheless, the murder was classified as a sex crime. Police didn't believe at first that there was enough evidence to connect Vian's homicide to the Otero murders. The reason? The phone line hadn't been cut. The killer didn't appear to have masturbated at the scene. The victimology was different, and none of Shirley's children were harmed. That the paramedics had disturbed the crime scene, removing Vian's various bindings, meant that police had nothing to visually link the two killings. They had to rely on the memories of Vian's kids and the emergency medical technicians to reconstruct the scene. Still, according to Jaworski, there were a few detectives on the force who whispered about possible parallels between the homicides. That they even toyed with the connection between the two murders spoke volumes about just how deeply the Otero's killer had wormed his way into the consciousness of the Wichita police force. But their suspicions never amounted to anything other than a collective gut hunch, certainly nothing anyone could prove, at least not until the killer penned his next letter, claiming responsibility for the killing. Over the next few weeks, nearly 50 people were interviewed by police. Because of the puzzling randomness of the murder, however, the hunt for a viable suspect quickly turned cold, and the case was put on the back burner. Yet, despite the lack of anything resembling a lead, investigators had a strong hunch that the photograph the killer displayed to Vian's son, Steve, was a snapshot of Cheryl Gilmore and her son. Gilmore was a neighbor on whose front door Steve saw the killer knock earlier that morning while walking home from the store. Detectives believed that Gilmore might have been the killer's intended target. She lived alone with her son and regularly came home for lunch from her job at a nearby optometrist's office. The only reason she wasn't home when the unsub knocked on her door was that she had to take her son to a medical appointment. Gilmore learned about the murders after returning home from work that afternoon. Her street was swarming with police and TV crews. The thought that she narrowly missed meeting the grisly fate suffered by Shirley spooked her horribly. But because she couldn't afford to move away from the area, she remained living in her house. Each night for the next year, she lay in bed with an unloaded shotgun, telling herself she'd use it as a club should the killer ever return. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if 5-year-old Steve hadn't bumped into that stranger roaming his neighborhood on that morning. The killer was obviously pumped up to murder someone, consumed with the need to control and devour another human being. When Gilmore wasn't home, I surmised, he remembered the boy he'd just spoken to and decided to see if there was anyone home at his house who might make a worthwhile victim. It was a bold, stupid maneuver that could have gotten him caught, but somehow pulled it off. It was close to midnight when I finally decided to pack up my paperwork and head home from the cemetery. The moon shone bright, but the beam of my flashlight had turned a weak yellow. I felt a bit calmer, more in control. The more I thought about the Vine case, the more I could sense that the unsub was probably kicking himself over how this killing had unfolded. 3 years had passed since his botched haphazard attack on Kathy Bright and her brother. The incident had no doubt spooked him, causing the part of him that hungered to murder to retreat and slink back underground in hiding. For 3 years, he no doubt plotted and fantasized over taking another victim. After his experience at Bright's house, I would have expected to see a smarter, savvier killer the next time he surfaced. But that wasn't really the case. For the most part, he bulldozed his way into Shirley Vine's house by fast talking a 5-year-old boy, then got out by the skin of his teeth. He was calculated and determined, but more than anything else, the killer was lucky. When I tried to imagine what transpired in Shirley Vine's bedroom on the afternoon the unsub stole her life, I caught glimpses of him standing in Shirley's bedroom over her body, drinking in the image of her wrapped up with all that cord and electrical tape. All the while, he was probably attempting to masturbate. But the children seemed intent on ruining everything with their incessant screaming and their pounding on the bathroom door and shattering of glass. He yearned to kill them, but first he needed to take care of business before the situation completely went south. So he continued masturbating, and when the phone in the front room started ringing, he finally decided he had had enough and fled. Police were never able to ascertain who had been calling, but whoever placed the call, no doubt, saved the lives of Vian's 3 kids. What was going through his head, I wondered, as he departed Vian's house? He'd obviously gone there because his intended target, the one who had consumed so many of his waking hours, wasn't at home. But the urge to kill was too strong, so he changed directions in midstream and struck out at random. Because of his inability to completely control his environment, however, he committed a less than perfect crime. What resulted was anything but the fantasy world he yearned for, a realm where he called all the shots and yanked all the strings. Nevertheless, he pulled it off and also managed to gather plenty of raw material to feed his ravenous imagination in the months and years that followed. After all, that was one of the real motives behind why these guys kill. From my work spent interviewing these monsters, I learned that for many, the act of killing was tantamount to putting money in the bank. They committed their brutal crimes not only to live out their fantasies, but also to provide fuel for future fantasies. The more visual memories they could bank, the larger the cachet they could draw on during those long days and nights when killing someone wasn't an option. Despite what I learned about this dark netherworld from the serial murders I'd interviewed, I realized I was just scratching the surface in my understanding of the strange powers this parallel universe held. But whether I understood it or not, there was no denying one thing. For most of these guys, their fantasy world, populated with victims, real, imagined, and of the soon to be variety, often felt more real than the world they dwelled in during their waking hours. Consequently, what's really important to these guys is that they develop an effective, consistent way to access this inner world. Judging from the precise way the unsub described his crime scenes, he seemed to be a very visually oriented person. That told me he would probably be the type to rely on drawings or perhaps photographs snapped at his crime scenes to help open up this trap door leading to his dark fantasy realm. Not all serial killers are visual types. Plenty of these guys make audio tapes of their torture and murder sessions. Afterwards, they listen to the recording of their victims screaming, begging for their lives, and in a few cases, pleading to be killed. Much like a normal person would listen to a piano concerto by Mozart on their stereo. The sounds transport them to that other world. I have to pause for a moment because sometimes he writes or explains some shit that's just too much for me to bear. And it just puts me at a place.
They will look at the saints of God and say, help me drive on, Satan away. Help me drive on, help me drive, help me drive on, help me drive on, help me drive on.
I kept several of these cassette tapes in a drawer of my desk. Listening to them never failed to make the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I've sat in a room with hardened veteran homicide detectives who could endure only a few minutes of these recordings before wincing and quickly exiting the room, shaking their head.
Help me drive, help me drive, help me drive on, help me drive on.
I once worked a case involving two truly savage murderers who used sound as a way to relive their killings. Lawrence Bittaker, convicted of assault with a deadly weapon, and rapist Roy Norris became pals while incarcerated at the California men's colony at San Luis Obispo. I tell you, California, that whole Pacific Northwest, that whole from the bottom of California all the way to the top of Canada, it churns out the most depraved killers, weirdos, sickos. Shortly before their release from prison, they hatched a plan to kill teenage girls, one for every teen year from 13 to 19. They yearned to record their crimes on audio tape. By June 1979, they purchased an old Ford van nicknamed Murder Mac and set out to fulfill their dark fantasy. In quick succession during that summer, they brutally raped, tortured, and killed four young girls. When police finally caught up with them, they quickly discovered the duo's collection of audio tapes. I'll never forget the afternoon I listened to one of their cassettes in preparation for an interview that I and a female agent did with Bittaker, who was sentenced to death for his crimes and sent to San Quentin State Prison.
Come to hinder, he come to hinder, come on.
During the recording, his cohort was driving the van while BTK, whose nickname was Pliers because this was his favorite instrument of torture, scripted the frightened, moaning 14-year-old girl, telling her exactly what he wanted to say as he slowly mutilated her. Just as the BTK posed his victims in order to see their bodies in his imagination, Whittaker needed to hear just the right combination of words in order to keep his victims alive within his head. The afternoon we finally sat down with this sad excuse for a human being in a San Quentin interview room, he was more than happy to spill his guts to us. The only glitch was that he refused to look at my female colleague when she asked him questions. That was how much he hated women. By the time our session was over, he was sobbing. Of course, his tears were for himself, not his victims. Walking back to my car, the moonbeam lit cemetery. You know, whew. Okay. Walking back to my car through the moonbeam lit cemetery, I caught myself thinking about the letter BTK sent to the police in October 1974. In it, he wrote, "Since sex criminals do not change their MO or by nature cannot do so, I will not change mine." I could only assume that he'd written this out of ignorance, because every criminal justice student with even the slightest bit of frontal lobe activity knows that killers do change their MO. It is their most malleable and fluid quality, a skill that is constantly evolving and changing to the point of perfection. BTK's method of killing appeared to be evolving. Instead of becoming more cautious, as one might have expected, he was taking more chances. His crime scenes revealed a high degree of organization, and he still seemed to be planning out his murders. But he'd begun developing a new skill. He now appeared comfortable with the idea of improvising when one of his victims didn't show up, which is what led to Shirley Vian's death. What I couldn't explain was the source of this impulsiveness. Was it born out of an inability to control his homicidal urges, of grandiose thinking, or of just plain carelessness? Then again, was it something else, something none of us in the criminology business had encountered before? My 20-minute-old sense of calmness and composure began to evaporate. There was just so much I didn't know, so many unanswered questions. What on earth could have compelled the unsub to tackle such high-risk targets in the middle of the day? It didn't make sense. Yet. All right. That concludes chapter 5. I need to take a little break. Here's a song.
each other's dreams. Jesus left a long time ago and said he would return, but he left us a book to believe in, and in it we gotta hold the lot to learn. Yeah, yeah, holy, he can't conquer. Holy, holy, holy. We can rock this earth's foundation. Yes, we can. Can't you see us, brothers and sisters, talking about love, 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 holy. We can rock this earth's foundation. Holy, can't you see us coming together, talking about love, moving and grooving with the love, living and giving with the love, doing and moving with love, 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 love. Holy, holy, we proclaim love. We proclaim love and power of salvation. Yeah, 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 yeah. Holy, 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 holy. Love right now, love right now, love. All right, here we go. We are at chapter 6. You know, I had a Wendy's Frosty. You drink shakes and, dairy stuff. It can cause a lot of phlegm in your throat. Excuse me. Okay. So we are at chapter 6. The next morning, I woke at 5:15 and got dressed for work. Pam was breathing softly, her head buried in her pillow. I watched her in the mirror while knotting my tie, thinking about how her stillness resembled that of a corpse. My job was devouring me. The violence was eating a dark hole inside me, and there seemed little I could do to escape it. Mm-mm-mm. A job like that would create issues for one now, wouldn't it? A few days before, I had taken my two daughters, Erica 8 and Lauren 4, to a wooded park near our house, but found myself constantly peering off into the brush, looking for the body of a murder victim that I tried to convince myself had been dumped there, then covered over by leaves. 2 weeks before that, while making love to Pam, a flashback had washed over me, and I suddenly found myself staring into the dying face that belonged to a woman whose torture slaying I was trying to help solve. Yeah, I think it was time for you to retire, buddy. On my way out of the bedroom, I bent down and brushed my lips past Pam's forehead, then walked downstairs and crept into my little girl's room and stood there, listening to the faint sound of their breathing, held spellbound by the way their tiny faces quivered as they slept. I was back at the office by 6:15. This was the only way I could ever get any work done, especially now that I was still having problems getting my post-coma brain to resume firing on all 8 cylinders. I told myself I'd get to the next installment of BTK homicides, this one involving what the killer surely must have considered to be his most satisfying murder, later in the afternoon. In the meantime, piles of file folders that desperately needed my attention were spread across my desk. This dynamic between organized and disorganized, chaos and order, proved to be a constant source of tension in my life. I was embarrassed to admit it, but I had the unshakable feeling that the man responsible for those unsolved killings in Wichita could probably teach me a thing or two about organization. BTK's murders employed elements that were both uniquely organized and disorganized. He could be sloppy at times, such as when leaving behind biological evidence at his crime scenes. But it was the razor sharp control that he obviously maintained after his murders that perplexed and astounded me. I wasn't sure what he did for work or even if he was married, but I felt confident that he never allowed his inner world, which seethed inside him like a bubbling cauldron, to bleed into his outer world. In the analysis I wrote in 1979, performed on the heels of his two last known murders, I thought they were looking for someone who resembled a monster. But 5 years had passed, and now I began to glimpse another element of his character. One of the reasons he was able to place so much time between his kills was because he'd somehow developed the ability to blend into his environment. It would be far too much to expect him to stand out in his community. The reason we couldn't see him was that we were looking past him, not at him. Shortly before lunch, I plowed through my paperwork, played Dear Abby to a couple of men in my unit, and was happily back at it up in my quiet corner of the law library, digging and sifting through the stack of reports that detailed BTK's last known murder, which occurred during the night of December 8th, 1977. Clearly, this was the unsub's most perfect kill, no doubt producing the kind of memories that might just have been tiding him over for these past few years. It began to unfold to the outside world with a phone call to an emergency dispatcher at 8:20 the next morning. For Wichita firefighter Wayne Davis, It had been shaping up to be a typical morning. Like plenty of his coworkers, he supplemented his income by working side jobs. On this particular chilly morning, he was sent to pick up a truck that was supposedly parked on St. Francis Street and drive it across town. But there was just one problem. Wayne couldn't find the damn thing. So when he spotted a payphone outside a market on the corner of St. Francis and Central Streets, he decided to pull over and call the guy who'd hired him. He hopped out of his car, shoved his hand in his pocket, and quickly realized he had no change. Just my luck, he shrugged as he hurried inside the market to break a dollar bill. A man was using the payphone, speaking quietly into the receiver, but Davis barely noticed him. In those few moments that David was inside the store, a brief, chilling exchange took place between the caller and two police dispatchers. You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, the man told the dispatcher. Nancy Fox. I'm sorry, sir, she replied. I can't understand you. What is the address? At that point, another dispatcher who had been monitoring the call interrupted, I believe 843 South Pershing. That is correct, the man said. Then the phone line went quiet. By the time Davis made it back into the parking lot, the caller had vanished and the receiver dangled in midair. Davis grabbed it, placed the phone against his ear, and when he didn't hear a dial tone, he said, Hello? The voice on the other end of the line inquired if he was the same person who'd she just been speaking to. No, he replied. Some other guy was using the phone. Wayne, is that you? The dispatcher asked, recognizing his voice because emergency calls were often routed through the fire department and the two regularly spoke to one another. Yes, me, he said, what's going on? A moment later, Wichita Homicide Captain Al Thimish jumped out on the line. The two men and their wives were longtime square dance buddies. Wayne, Thimish asked, did you get a look at the guy on the phone? Not really, he said. What's all the fuss about? Thimish quickly filled him in on the details. When it became apparent that Davis could recall precious little about the caller's appearance, Thimish asked if he'd object to undergoing hypnosis at police headquarters. No problem, Davis replied. But there was a problem. The killer had surfaced again. For 7 brief seconds and in 15 words, he'd broken his silence and risked everything to let the local authorities know he'd returned. Shortly before 8:30, two patrol cars pulled up to the curbside. Shortly before 8:30, two patrol cars pulled up to the curb beside the pink duplex identified by the caller. The two officers who arrived at the scene quickly surveyed the exterior of the house. A back window had been shattered, they observed, and the phone line leading into the dwelling had been cut. The front door was unlocked. The officers entered the house and were hit by a blast of hot air. A moment later, 25-year-old Nancy Fox was found lying face down on the neon blue paisley bedspread, wearing only a pale pink long sleeved sweater. The tips of her toes, which hung over the edge of the mattress, had turned black. The nails of her long, slender fingers were pink. Something about the way they were positioned, partially extended, partially curled, looked deceivingly peaceful. Nylon, nylon stockings tightly bound her wrists behind her back. Her violet-colored panties had been pulled down around her hips, just above her knees. A cream-colored yellow nightgown had been tied around her ankles. When police rolled Fox over, they saw that the left side of her face had also turned black. In her mouth was stuffed a gag fashioned out of various colored pantyhose, and her dark tongue was swollen Too many times it's normal size. Wisps of sandy blonde hair covered much of her face, but beneath it smears of blood could be seen caked around her nose and mouth. Another pair of pantyhose had been cinched tightly around her neck. Ooh, whoever did this was a real pervert.
Don't want it, yeah. We don't need it, yeah. Help me try. Help me try.
Whoever did this was a real pervert, recalled one homicide detective who arrived at the crime scene a few minutes later. You could just see the sexual perversion all over that poor girl. The whole thing really just aggravated me. Dumped on a coffee table were the contents of Nancy Fox's purse. The killer, it was believed, had taken her driver's license as a souvenir. On the dresser beside the bed sat a picture of Fox's bowling team. She and four friends stood there beside their bowling balls, goofy grins plastered on their faces. On either side of the picture, two jewelry boxes appeared to have been rifled through. On the bed next to Fox's body, the contents of her lingerie drawer had been dumped. Police speculated that the killer had been searching for suitable bindings and gags. They also theorized that he turned up the thermostat in order to compensate for the cold air that had entered the dwelling through the window he'd shattered. Semen was found at the scene in a blue nightgown left at the head of the bed. Crime scene technicians were able to retrieve enough of a sample to send it quickly to the state crime lab in Topeka and have it analyzed. This was a decade before the advent of DNA testing, and the only thing police could hope to glean from the sperm sample was the blood type of the person it came from.
Drive him away, Lord. Drive him away, Lord. Put the blood on him. The blood of Jesus is against him.
What they learned did little to help investigators focus their efforts. From For the sperm had come from someone classified as a PGM1 non-secretor. In layman's terms, this meant that the unsub had just hit the genetic jackpot. Because if you're going to leave sperm behind at a crime scene, you could only hope to be a PGM1 non-secretor, as this made trying to pinpoint your blood type physically impossible. The search for other types of evidence also proved less than fruitful. In an effort to determine if the killer left behind any fingerprints on Fox's body, investigators employed what was, at the time, considered to be a newfangled forensic technique. A week before the murder, the department's fingerprint technician had just attended a seminar on fuming, which involved erecting a makeshift plastic tent over the bed and pouring a chemical known as cyanoacrylate, commonly referred to as superglue, into a ceramic bowl, then heating it at a low temperature. Over the next 2 hours, the chemicals vaporized inside the tent and adhered to any of the oils left behind by fingerprints, which were visible when viewed under a black light. When the process was finished, a portion of several fingerprints and part of a palm print were detected on Fox's body, but they weren't sufficient in helping police locate any suspects. By late afternoon, Fox's body was wheeled out on a gurney and driven to St. Francis Hospital 4 miles away. An autopsy determined that she died from strangulation. Yet, the coroner found that despite partially undressing his victim and binding her, the killer had not raped or penetrated her. As a battery of tests were being run on Fox's body, Detectives were busy interviewing her friends, family, and coworkers, enabling them to reconstruct her final hours. They learned that shortly after 9 p.m., Nancy Fox left her job at Hellsberg's jewelry store at the Wichita Mall, where she worked as an assistant manager. On her way home, she grabbed a burger at a drive-through fast food joint, then continued back to the duplex where she lived alone in a quiet, relatively crime-free lower middle class neighborhood. Detectives postulated that once inside, Fox had had a smoke, downed a glass of water, then undressed for bed, neatly folding her tam skirt over a wooden chair. It was at this point police believed that the killer, who had been hiding in Fox's bedroom closet, appeared and forced her onto the bed. Although I had no way of proving it, I speculated that the killer masturbated into Fox's nightgown only after his victim had died. His inability to rape or penetrate any of his victims told me that he was so fearful of women that a woman's lifeless but partially naked body would represent the ultimate sexual turn on. Once dead, she became the perfect object. First of all, let me say this. Later on, you find out the reason, I said this like in the introduction video, the reason why BTK never raped any of his victims, whether they were dead or alive, is because he didn't believe in committing adultery. He just did not cheat on his wife. Go figure. Once dead, she became the perfect object, non threatening, no longer human, nothing more than a flesh covered mannequin, all the things he dreamed about. Which is why the man responsible for Fox's death went to such lengths to pose the body of his victim, much the way a painter or sculptor might pose a model. Everything about her positioning on the bed, the tilt of her head, the way her panties were pulled down to her knees, her various bindings and gags fashioned from pantyhose, revealed to me that the killer wasn't posing his victim merely as a way to shock police who arrived at the scene. Just as he did with the body of Shirley Vian, the unsupposed Fox because he had to. The images he created at his crime scenes were similar to a cache of food. He needed to pose Fox in order to take mental snapshots of her body, then use that memory to get him through those long, lean periods when killing wouldn't be an option. Harvey Glatzman, billed as the nation's first modern serial killer, went to similar lengths when displaying the bodies of his victims. A hardcore bondage freak, he documented his many kills in diaries and with countless photographs he snapped and later developed in his darkroom. But Gladman wasn't content merely to take pictures of his victims' bodies after murdering them. He used his camera to chronicle his killings, capturing the look of terror on the faces of his victims before garroting them with a piece of rope. More than anything else, Gladman got off on preserving in a photograph that empty, glazed look of primal fear and hopelessness in the eyes of those he killed. I often wondered what sort of role model this sick man had been for BTK. They were both consumed by bondage, and because of his detailed crime scene descriptions, I believed BTK was also photographing his victims. As a child, Glatman possessed an insatiable obsession with bondage and ropes. In his early teens, he spent hours masturbating in the attic, hanging himself from the rafters in an effort to heighten his orgasms. A family doctor told his concerned parents to ignore their son's strange hobby because he'd one day grow out of it. By the time Gladman turned 16, he used a cap gun to force a girl to undress. He was quickly arrested and, upon being released on bail, traveled to New York. Not long afterward, he was arrested for robbery and sent to jail for 5 years. After his release in 1951, Gladman moved to Los Angeles and opened a TV repair shop. To the outside world, he lived a fairly quiet life and did his best to keep away from women. Then, one sweltering afternoon in July 1957, the dam broke, and Gladman's self imposed exile from the opposite sex ended. An avid amateur shutterbug, he convinced a 19-year-old model he met while on a TV repair job to pose for him, telling her he made extra cash shooting pictures for detective magazines. She showed up at his house a few days later, eager to pocket the $50 he promised her for the photo shoot. Within minutes of her arrival, he raped her at gunpoint, then drove her out to a remote expanse of desert outside Los Angeles. He stripped the hysterical woman to her underwear and, before strangling her, shot pictures of her pleading for her life. Over the next year, he killed two other women using his photography ruse in order to win them over. Gladman wasn't caught until one of his would-be victims, whom he'd already shot through the thigh, grabbed his pistol while he drove her on a one-way ride out to the desert. When taken into custody, Gladman gleefully provided officers with detailed accounts of each of his killings. He was executed by cyanide gas in San Quentin's death chamber in 1959. BTK could very well feel a kinship with a sick killer like Gladman. After all, he seemed to possess a fantasy life every bit as intense and consuming as Harvey's. Yet, Gladman's main problem was his inability to harness this invisible world inside his head. If he had been able to do so, that world might have provided sustenance for him during those stretches when he should have been lying low, which was, it appeared, what Nancy Fox's killer had been doing for the 9 months since his murder of Shirley Vian. He managed to restrain himself, and it was also what he did for the next 2 months after Fox's death. He retreated back into the shadows and no doubt did his best to resume his day to day life. The brazenness of Nancy Fox's killer both sickened and intrigued the community, at least for a week or two. The murder, to murder an innocent young woman was terrible enough, but to actually pick up a phone and notify police about the killing seemed unfathomable. What in God's name would he have to gain by doing that? Most people thought, other than to flaunt his handiwork. At this point, the crime still hadn't been connected with any of the unsub's previous killings. Police focused much of their efforts on three of Nancy's former boyfriends, But this quickly led nowhere. To nearly everyone but her grieving family and friends, her death began to feel like nothing more than a terribly random, isolated act of violence. And this, I believe, must have irked the unsub. The rush brought on from Nancy's killing would have faded in a matter of weeks. True, the murder would have provided him with plenty of sick memories, but something told me that Fox's murder just wasn't receiving the kind of attention BTK had hoped and yearned for. Media interest in the killing quickly waned, especially because police didn't have any real suspects other than the mysterious man who phoned in to report the murder. A recording of his voice was played over and over on local radio and TV stations, but no one could identify the man behind the voice. FBI voice analysts were unable to uncover anything of value from the 7-second audio clip, such as whether or not the caller had attempted to mask his voice. The only thing police knew about the caller came from information fireman Wayne Davis provided. The man was 6 feet tall, blond haired, dressed in gray industrial uniform, and wearing a hat with ear flaps. Davis also reported that the man might have driven a late model van with some sort of writing on its side. After undergoing 4 sessions with a hypnotherapist, that was all Davis could retrieve from his subconscious. The general consensus among detectives was that he was blocking due to a very primal emotion, fear. It wasn't that he didn't want to help, said one officer working on the case. I think he was just scared. On the last day of January, BTK's desire to stir things up appeared to get the better of him. He penned a pithy Valentine's poem to his latest victim, then sent it to the local newspaper. It wouldn't be discovered for nearly 2 weeks. By this point, police still hadn't made the connection between Shirley Vian's murder and Fox's, nor had they established any links with either of those homicides and the killing of Kathy Bright and the Otero family. But that was about to change when BTK decided the time had come to stick the knife and twist it just a bit. And in one terrifying moment, the murders of the Oteros, Vian, and Fox would be irrevocably linked, although several more years would pass before the identity of Bright's killer would be understood. All hell broke loose in Wichita on the morning of February 10th, 1978, when BTK surfaced again, setting in motion a chain of events that finally garnered for him the type of attention he craved. A receptionist at the offices of the local ABC affiliate, Cake TV 10, opened an envelope that morning and discovered 4 pages of photocopied material that included a letter and a poem, both filled with punctuation and spelling errors, and a drawing of a woman bound, gagged, and lying face down on a bed. This communique was the killer's most prolific public confession to date and a chilling taunt. It also provided me with a revealing glimpse into his brain. Oh, Lord. We don't want to care. We don't need to care. Help me try. Help me try. So this is what BTK sent to the news station. I find the newspaper not writing about the poem on Vian unamusing. A little paragraph would have enough. I know it not the media fault. I'm reading it just as it is written, by the way. I know it not the media fault. The police chief, he keep things quiet and doesn't let the public know there's a psycho running around loose, strangling mostly women. There's 7 in the ground. Who will be next? How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention? Do the cop think that all these deaths are not related? Golly gee. Yes, the MO is different in each, but look, a pattern is developing. The victims are tired. Most have been women. Phone cut. Bring some bondage. Matter sadistic tendencies. No struggle. Outside the death spot. No witnesses except the Vanes kids. They were very lucky. A phone call saved them. I was going to take the boys and put plastic bags over their head like I did Joseph and Shirley, and then hang the girl. God, oh God, what a beautiful sexual relief that would have been. Josephine, when I hung her, really turned me on. Her pleading for mercy, then the rope took hold. She helpless, staring at me with wide terror-filled eyes, the rope getting tighter, tighter. You don't understand these things because you're not under the influence of Factor X. Same thing that made Son of Sam, Jack the Ripper, Havery Glatman, Boston Strangler, Dr. H. Holmes, Pantyhose Strangler of Florida, Hillside Strangler, Ted of the West Coast, and many, many more famous character kill, which seems senseless, but we cannot help it. There is no help, no cure except death or being caught and put away. It a terrible nightmare, but you see, I don't lose any sleep over it. After a thing like Fox, I come home and go about life like anyone else, and I will be like that until the urge hit me again. It's not continuous, and I don't have a lot of time. It take time to set a kill. One mistake and it all over. Since I about blew it on the phone, handwriting is out. Letter guide is too long and typewriter can be traced too. So my short poem of death and maybe a drawing. Later on, real picture and maybe a tape of the sound will come your way. How will you know me? Before a murder or murders, you will receive a copy of the initials BTK. You keep that copy. The original will show up someday on Guess Who? May you not be the unluck one. P.S. How about some name for me? It's time. 7 down and many more to go. I like the following. How about you? The BTK Strangler, Wichita Strangler, Poetic Strangler, the Bondage Strangler, or Psycho, the Wichita Hangman, the Wichita Executioner, the Garrote Phantom, the Asphyxiator. Number 5, you guess motive and victim. Number 6, you found one Shirley Vane lying belly down on an unmade bed in northeast bedroom, hand tied behind back with black tape and cord, feet and ankles with black tape and legs, ankles tied to west head of the bed with small off-white cord wrap around legs, hands, arm, finally the neck many times. A off-white plastic bag over her head, loop on with a pink nightie, was barefooted. She was sick use a glass of water and smoke or one or two cigarette. House a total mess. Kids took some toys with them to the bathroom. Bed against east bathroom door. Chose at random with some pre-planning. Motive factor X. Number 7. One Nancy Fox, lying belly down on made bed in southwest bedroom, hands tied behind back with real pantyhose, feet together with yellow nightie semi-nude with pink sweater and bra small, necklace glasses on west dresser, panties below but many different from the hosiery. She had a smoke and went to the bathroom before the final act. Very neat housekeeper. Dresser rifled, purse in kitchen, empty paper bag, white coat in living room. Heat up to about 90 degrees. Christmas tree lights on, nighties and hose around the room. Hose bag of orange color, it had hosiery on bed. Driver license gone. Seminole stain on or in blue women wear. Chose at random with little pre-planning. Motive factor X. Number 8. Next victim maybe. You will find her hanging with a wire noose. Hands behind back with black tape or cord. Feet with tape or cord gauged, then cord around the body to the neck. Hooded maybe. Possible seminal stain in anus or on body. Will be chosen at random. Some pre-planning. Motive factor X. Enclosed with the letter was a poem and a pencil sketch that closely resembled the scene officers saw when they entered Nancy Fox's sweltering apartment on the morning of December 9th, 1977. The poem, titled "Ode Death to Nancy," was based on an Appalachian folk song called "Oh Death." What is that I can see? Cold icy hands taking hold of me. For death has come, you all can see. Hell has opened its gate to trick me. Oh death, can't you spare me over for another year? I'll stuff your jaws till you can't talk. I'll bind your legs till you can't walk. I'll tie your hands till you can't make a stand. And finally, I'll close your eyes so you can't see. I'll bring sexual death unto you for me.
Drive him away, Lord. Drive him away, Lord. Put the blood on him. The blood of Jesus is against him. Help me drive him. Yeah, drive him. Help us drive. Help us drive. Oh. Drive him. Help me drive him. Help me drive. Help me drive. Help me drive him. Help me drive him.
Whew. Yes, Lord. Y'all pardon me when I do these little intermissions because I don't know about you, but this stuff gets a little bit too heavy and I just feel more at ease with the gospel music and drive old Satan away. You don't want the devil that's being written in this book, having his tentacles reach out and access your spirit. The devil is a liar. When KAKE news producer Ron Lowen delivered the packet to Police Chief Richard Lamunion, it proved to be the final straw that forced the top police department official in town to do the very thing he dreaded most: go public with the news that a serial killer was stalking the streets of Wichita and that police, despite their best efforts, had been so far powerless to stop him. For someone in Lamunion's position, having to stand up in front of the community that entrusted him to protect it and admit that a predatory sexual killer was on the loose is tantamount to screaming fire in a packed theater. The reaction, he knew, would be predictable and swift: panic, widespread fear, perhaps a touch of civil chaos, followed by anger, finger pointing, and a flood of useless tips inundating police. But despite this inevitable reaction, clearly the genie could no longer be kept in the bottle. He'd grown too bold and lethal. By mid-afternoon on Friday, February 10th, a few hours after the Fox letter was dropped on his desk, Lamunion put out the word that a press conference would be held that evening at City Hall. What he was about to tell the city's media made headlines around the nation. By the time reporters began filing into the building, a tense buzz hung in the air. Something big and ugly was afoot. The sun had set, snow was piled in the gutters of downtown, and the air held a cold sting to it, reminiscent of that winter day 4 years before when four bodies were discovered inside the Otero home. The purpose of this news conference is to advise the public of an extremely serious matter involving a series of murders which have occurred in our city, he said slowly, pausing every few words to allow the gravity of his message to sink in. As you know, in January 1974, four members of the Otero family were murdered. In March of 1977, Shirley Vian was killed. And in December 1977, Nancy Fox was also murdered. Earlier today, Cake TV received and immediately brought me a letter wherein the author took credit for the Otero, the Fox, and the Vian murders. In addition, whoever wrote this letter has taken credit for a seventh victim. We are convinced without a doubt that the person who claims to have killed the Oteros, Miss Fox and Miss Vian, is in fact the same person. I want to restate that there is no question in our minds but that the person who wrote the letter killed these people. This person has consistently identified himself with the initials BTK and wishes to be known as the BTK Strangler. Because we are sure this man is responsible for 7 murders, we wish to enlist the assistance of each citizen of this community. Our police department has already begun special efforts, which are as follows. 1. Additional uniformed officers are already on the street. 2. A special detective task force involving the Major K Squad has been established. 3. A special phone number for citizens to call has been established, 269-4177. This phone will be staffed 24 hours a day. 4. We have solicited the assistance of the district attorney, the sheriff, and of professionals in the field of human behavior and would welcome assistance from any person regardless of their expertise. I know it is difficult to ask people to remain calm, but we are asking exactly this. When a person of this type is at large in our community, it requires special precautions and special awareness by everyone. The one thing that struck me about Lamunion's press conference was how honest he was with the residents of Wichita. Hearing him admit that his investigators had no solid leads in the case made my head spin for one simple reason. It let the killer off the hook far too easily. And that was the last thing the authorities should have done. In my opinion, their best course of action was to keep the heat turned up on the unsub, to force him to continue looking over his shoulder, asking himself when police were going to come crashing through his back door. Not surprisingly, Lamunion's announcement sent a collective shudder through the community, especially when, several days later, an unfounded rumor began sweeping through the city. BTK, it seemed, targeted only the occupants of residences located on the west side of a north and south running street with a house address containing a number 3 within it. Even if this had been true, I would have written it off to coincidence. Serial killers, I'd learned, are far more interested in finding a victim who, because of his or her various traits and attributes, satisfied them psychologically rather than one who has a certain number in his or her street address. BTK's habit of cutting the outside phone lines of his victims was also mentioned in the press conference. That evening, thousands of residents throughout the city began a ritual that would last for years. The first thing they did upon entering their home was check to see if the phone worked. Others made it a habit before entering their house to dial their home number from a payphone to see if their phone rang. Within days, the sale of guns soared. So did the demand for additional door locks and peepholes and mace. Because anyone could be the killer, nobody felt safe, and every stranger seemed like a suspect. Paranoia swept through the community like fire through a prairie grassland, which certainly must have sent shivers of ecstasy up the unsub's spine. Because at its core, BTK's letter was no different than the ones the son of Sam used to pen during his 1 year killing spree that began in July 1976. Like the son of Sam, BTK wasn't seeking notoriety initially, but he soon took that direction when the press began running stories. Both offenders relished the publicity, and each felt good about the terror and fear they were creating and causing to unfold in their respective communities. Both had become the boogeyman, a role to which they quickly became addicted. Police were initially stumped about the way BTK opened his communique, complaining about the newspaper not writing about the poem of Vane. Of course, it didn't take Sherlock Holmes to understand that the killer was referring to Shirley Vian. Within hours of Lamunion's press conference, The full answer became apparent when an employee of the Wichita Eagle discovered that a 3x5 index card, which arrived in the newsroom on January 31st, had mistakenly been routed to the newspaper's advertising department. Because the cryptic message on the card was printed in children's block letters from a rubber stamp, whoever first spotted the card believed it to be a personal ad, not a poem based on the murder of Shirley Vian. It was based on an 18th century Mother Goose nursery rhyme titled Curly Locks. Shirley Locks, wilt thou be mine? Thou shalt not scream, not yet feel the line, but lay on cushion and think of me in death and how it is going to be. At the bottom of the card, he printed the message, poem for Fox next.
He come to hinder. He come to hinder here. Come on. Help me drive on. Help me drive on.
Oh boy. If you don't mind, I have a couple more pages to read before I finish this chapter. I just need to take a break, get something to drink. I've been reading a lot. My mouth and throat is dry. And, I just got to pull back from reading this for a few minutes. Let's hear something. Well, listen to this one. Listen. I don't want to hear an ad.
Don't moan. Listen, baby. Tell the sister, don't moan. Pharaoh's army. All of them men got drowned in the sea one day. Yes, they did. Man, Mary, don't weep. Tell Martha not to moan. Don't moan. Don't moan. Yeah, if I could, I surely would. I'd stand right up on the rock. Yes, I would. I'd stand Pharaoh's army. I know you know that story of how they got drowned in the sea one day. Oh yeah, Jesus said, Mary, Mary, don't weep, don't weep. Tell your sister not to mourn, don't mourn, don't mourn. We're gonna review the story of two sisters called Mary and Martha. They had a brother named Lazarus. One day while Jesus was away, that dear brother died. Yeah, yeah. When I met, went running to Jesus, she said, Master, sweet Lord. Oh, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Oh, yes, she did. Jesus said, come on and show me where you're buried. Show me where you laid him down. And when he got there, Jesus said, for the benefit of you who don't believe in me this evening, I'm gonna call it free time. Oh, yes, I am. Oh, yes, I am. He said, Lazarus, hear my voice. Oh, yeah. He got up walking like a natural man. Oh, yes, he did. Oh, yes, he did. Jesus said, oh, man, don't you leave. Go on home and don't you and your sister moan. Don't moan no more. Because you see, Pharaoh's army, they got drowned. They got drowned. Martha, don't you mourn.
You need a friend. And Jesus said, call my name, because I'll be there.
When you're down in trouble, you need Ain't nothing going right. Lord, close your eyes and meditate on Him, and soon He will be there. God can brighten up. He can brighten up your darkest hour. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm back. All right, here we go. Where were we? The unsub waited 14 months before surfacing again, although initially police had their doubts that it was actually him. Just after 10 p.m. on the cool spring night of April 28, 1979, a 61-year-old widow named Anna Williams returned home after a night of square dancing. She lived at 615 South Pinecrest, roughly 1 mile from Nancy Fox's house. Friends dropped her off at her house and watched as she fumbled for her keys on the front porch. But just before unlocking the door, she decided to reconsider their offer of a cup of coffee at a local cafe. She dropped her keys in her purse, climbed back into their car, and was whisked away into the night. An hour later, she once again returned home and quickly discovered that one of her basement windows had been shattered. Rope, a broom handle, and several pieces of undergarments were found lying beside a bed in the basement guest room where her granddaughter often slept. Williams walked back upstairs and noticed that several scarves, pieces of jewelry, various articles of clothing, and $35 in cash were missing. A half roll of toilet paper had also been used, she realized. Most frightening of all, when she tried to telephone police, she couldn't get a dial tone. She hurried next door to a neighbor's house and phoned police. A few minutes later, a squad car pulled up to the house, and two patrolmen began asking the badly shaken Williams questions. She'd been in poor health ever since the recent death of her husband, and this near disaster seemed on the verge of pushing her over the edge. One of the officers, who poked around the backyard with a flashlight, spotted the reason why her phone was dead. The line had been cut. Burglary investigators combed through the house, searching for fingerprints and traces of semen, but nothing was found. A crime report was taken, but it quickly disappeared into a file cabinet. And because there was no reason to do so, it was never shared with homicide detectives in the police department's burglary unit. No mention of the incident appeared in the local newspaper. Williams, however, never believed a random burglar was responsible for the break-in. In her heart, she believed it to be the work of BTK. In his heart, the individual responsible for breaking in couldn't stand it that the news of his most recent surfacing didn't make headlines. On June 15th, a manila envelope printed in neat black block letters arrived at Williams' home and was opened by her daughter. It contained her mother's pilfered scarf and jewelry. Also stuffed inside the envelope was a typed photocopied poem of a drawing and a drawing of a bound nude woman lying face down on her bed. A broomstick had been inserted into what appeared to be either her vagina or anus. William's daughter telephoned police without ever showing the letter to Anna. 2 days later, the Wichita Eagle ran the headline, BTK is back. Intended victim gets poem on the front page. True to his word, BTK had chosen his eighth victim. The only problem was she never bothered to show up. In his 19-line poem titled, Oh Anna, Why Didn't You Appear? He aired his frustration at being denied the pleasure of getting to snuff out another life. 'Twas the perfect plan of deviant pleasure, so bold on that spring night, my inner felling hot with propension of the new awakening season. Worn, wet with inner fear and rapture, my pleasure of entanglement, like new vines at night. Oh, Anna, why didn't you appear? Drop of fear, fresh spring rain would roll down from your nakedness to scent to lofty fever that burns within. In that small world of longing, fear, rapture, and desperation, the game we play fall on devil's ears. Fantasy spring forth, mounts to storm fury, then winter clam at the end. Oh, Anna, why didn't you appear? Alone, now in another time span, I lay with sweet enrapture garments across most private thought. Bed of spring moist grass, clean before the sun, enslaved with control. Warm wind scenting the air, sunlight sparkled tears in eyes so deep and clear. Alone again, I trod in past memory of mirrors and ponder why for number 8 was not. Oh, Anna, why didn't you appear?
We don't want to care. We don't need to care. Help me drive. Help me drive.
Although the unsub possessed the poetic sensibility of a love-drunk college freshman, his communiques reinforced my belief that he possessed an eye for detail. I couldn't shake the idea that he snapped photographs of his victims, crime scenes, and, in Anna Williams' case, his intended crime scene. Either that or he had a photographic memory which seemed unlikely. His sketches, moreover, weren't half bad, detailed and reasonably well drawn. They weren't Michelangelo, but he drew a hell of a lot better than I did. Although his subject matter was a bit limited, I sensed that he honed his ability to draw gagged, scantily clad women bound up in rope by staring at the pages of pulp detective magazines sold up through the mid 1970s in almost every mom and pop convenience store around the nation. We in the criminal profiling business refer to the violent offenders who read these magazines as collectors. These glossy publications, which usually bore a cover photo of a hog-tied, frightened woman with a gun or knife pressed against her breast or temple, served as virtual textbooks for budding killers. Criminologists like myself had long suspected that killers studied the exploits of those savages who'd come before them, soaking up every detail of true or fictional crimes wherever they can find it magazines, books, movies, and TV. Long before any of these animals ever claimed their first victim, they spent a lifetime nurturing the dark dreams festering inside their heads by devouring publications with names like Master Detective, Official Police Detective, Front Page Detective, and Startling Detective. Do the words and images contained in these pages of these magazines create violent criminals? Certainly not. But clearly, they fuel their sick fantasies. The way I see it, precious few people who read true or fictional crime books harbor some latent desire to go out and kill someone. People read them for the same reason they rubberneck when driving past a bloody automobile accident. They want a glimpse of horror, but they don't want to get too close to the blood and gore. Others consume these books and magazines in order to understand a violent offender's background, to grasp what makes him so different than the rest of us, particularly when they seem to so closely resemble us. Did BTK read these magazines? I would have bet my FBI pension on it. Wow, that's a lot of fucking money. The one thing that this violent media didn't do, however, was cause these individuals to become killers. It only fueled their already deeply embedded fantasies and provided literal models of horrible acts in vivid detail. For me, the killer who drove home the idea that violent offenders learn the tools of their trade from their elders was a balding, gaunt serial killer named Joseph Fisher. On the evening I showed up at Attica State Prison to speak with him back in 1981, it was hard to imagine how this former transient could have killed 6 women during his wanderings across the nation. Yet Fisher, who insisted that he'd actually murdered 32 people, put this killer nurturing killer concept into perspective for me in a way that none of the other murderers I'd interviewed before had. It's kind of like guys who follow baseball or football, he told me in that dimly lit prison interrogation room. They know all the batting averages, yards per game, interceptions versus touchdowns, where the players went to high school. They know every stat about all their favorite players. Fisher took a deep breath and began tracing an imaginary circle into the top of the table that separated the two of us. Well, those other guys got their games, and guys like me, we got our games. I didn't grow up wanting to hit home runs. I grew up wanting to kill people. And I used to soak up every bit of information I could find on the guys who were good at playing my kind of game. It always made me sick to my stomach when guys like Fisher referred to their habit of killing innocent people as a game. But clearly that's what it had become for BTK, a deadly game that nobody had yet been able to stop. And by the summer of 1979, when the locals in Wichita learned that the serial killer living in their midst wasn't going away, BTK finally graduated from rookie player to coach, from pupil to teacher. He'd finally achieved what he craved most, the chance to be somebody. These last communications had revealed that in his mind, he transcended to the next level in terms of his ability and proficiency as a killer. And now he yearned for some degree of recognition for his accomplishments. The buzz from all the mayhem he created must have been intense, but it wouldn't last forever. That giddy sensation of self-worth would eventually fade, just as everything else that sustained him did. And when that emptiness and self-loathing returned and grew too intense, we'd hear from him again. The only question was when. So that concludes the reading of chapter 5 and chapter 6. Today's date is September 16th. I have uh, 8 days
before I can go live again and do some more readings from this book, I have exhausted my 20 hours allotted by StreamYards. So I think I have read enough um, over the last few broadcasts to keep you busy and occupied while you work or while you're trying to fall asleep or you're just sitting around doing nothing. And we'll be back again on the 24th, I believe. Yes, the 24th. And we'll begin with chapter 7. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you're enjoying this. And just to keep you spiritually safe, I will end this broadcast again with another gospel song. Like to hear it? Here it go. Goodbye.
Jesus, how I love, I love to follow you from the path of sin that I have trod. Oh, thank you, Lord. You see, I knew for myself that all I have to do is follow you. And your hand, oh, it will lead, it will lead me on to God. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yes, it would. I remember, the day when Jesus, He saved my soul and He restored. Yes, He did. He washed all my sins away. Yeah. And it was nobody but the Savior, that made me whole. To the sick man, he lived. If you're having problems, he lived. Jesus lived. He died, but he got up on the third morning with all power in his hand. And there's an empty grave to prove and live that he lived. I'm a living witness tonight that he lived. Oh, he lived. Somebody might want to know how God knows. He woke me